Kate Falcha, welcome to Irish Granny Helen. It's time for our Saturday book, and I've got a doozy for us this next couple of weeks. This is The Invisible College by Jacques Vallee. I love his name. Jacques Vallee is the OG expert on things like the intersection between lore, mythology, folklore, and UFOs. Okay, let me read you a little bit about Jacques Vallee. He began his professional life as an astronomer at the Paris Observatory in 1961. While on the staff of the French Space Committee, he witnessed the destruction of the tracking tapes of unknown objects orbiting the Earth, initiating a lifelong interest in the UFO phenomenon, as in, hey, what are they destroying those for? Vallee arrived in the U.S. in 1962 and worked in astronomy at the University of Texas at Austin before receiving a PhD in computer science, because he's smart, from Northwestern University in 1967. There he became a close associate of J. Allen Hynek. And if you are a devotee of all things UFO, his name should jump out at you. Hynek was then a scientific consultant for the Air Force on Project Blue Book. And the result of the collaboration between Vallee and Hynek is this book. Now, this book is old. It was written originally in 1975. However, it was redone in 2014. And he talks about the whole idea that it's old and yet everything old is new again. I'll point out something, a little tidbit about Jacques Vallee. If you've seen the movie Close Encounters, and if you hadn't, why haven't you? If you've seen the movie Close Encounters, at the very end, there's the big scene, the drama scene, where the spaceship lands, the UFO is on the ground, and it opens up. And the scientist plays keyboard. Do, 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 do. You're welcome. And the people inside who have been abducted, I guess, are drawn out towards the music. They come out of the light into back on Earth. And the person who's playing this music is a French scientist, supposed to be Jacques Vallee. Okay, let's see here. Okay. Hang on. I'm in the middle of a situation. Just hang on. And we will begin. 3, 2, 1. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. The Invisible College by Jacques Vallee. And it begins with a foreword. It was first published in 1975 in New York City, and it raised all these new questions. And this is the important thing to keep in the back of your mind. I'm sorry, I know that this reflection is really obnoxious, but I also can't see. Keep in the back of your mind when this was written. Much of what we take for granted today as more of an openness and more of an awareness of some phenomenon, we don't know what it is still. Many theories about government involvement and military involvement and intelligence involvement and global international connections and all of the weight of literature, fiction and nonfiction, had yet to really been written. Very little of it had been written. We had The Interrupted Journey about the story of the Barney and Betty Hill, and the story of, what is her name? Andreasen, I think her last name was, whose family was multiple generation abductees and experiencers. But all of the other things that become familiar with, many of which I have covered on my channel, didn't exist yet. They were not a source of popular conversation. You could not turn on the television and watch Ancient Aliens or UFO hunters or, nothing like that. Nothing like that. And people were much more predisposed to ridicule and dismiss and think, oh, well, nuts. The old tinfoil hat meme, was very popular. So this book, when it came out in 1975, it raised all kinds of questions about paranormal research as well as just UFOs. He wanted to bridge the gap between the study of psychic functioning and the study of unidentified aerial phenomena. Most advocates say that UFOs are real, like three-dimensional physical flying things, technology from another physical planet or dimension, and it's the possibilities have become more sophisticated. It used to be little green men from Mars, and then it was, well, something from another planet, and then it was something from another galaxy, and now we talk about the universe has endless numbers of galaxies and endless numbers of potential life, places that support life, and that life, who knows what it might look like? Will it be humanoid? Not necessarily, probably not, actually. And then potentially they might come from a different dimension. And then what about time travel? And maybe they are us. And so these stories have evolved, become more sophisticated, more nuanced, and we're in relatively early days here when this was first written. So if it sounds a little dated, that's okay because of the context. And I think one of the points that Vallee wanted to make when he re-released this was that we're still asking these questions. Why is that? So most people were convinced that UFOs were objects from other planets and that public opinion would get the governments involved and then it would all be okay. However, there was a small team of people at Northwestern University that were dedicated researchers. And let's see here. I didn't want to write out all their names. It was too much effort. Fred Beckman from the University of Chicago, William Powers at Northwestern, Douglas Price Williams at UCLA, Ted Phillips in Missouri, and half a dozen others. And they began exchanging data and analyses on a regular basis. They were joined by distinguished French researchers, philosopher Aimé Michel's circle. We're not French, so we probably don't know what that is, but it was a group of people in the circle around a philosopher. Planetary astronomer Pierre Guérin, Sorbonne biologist and parapsychologist Rémy Chauvin, and relativist Olivier Costa de Beauregard. That's a name. Along with aerospace expert Dr. Claude Poher at CNES. So he's name dropping here, and we may or may not have recognized those names in 1975. They may or may not still be working today. But he's trying to name drop, and he's saying here are legitimate people in the sciences and philosophy. They're taking it seriously. This was an informal international network, and they believed that the explanation for UFOs was not as simple as the public would like to think. Now, they had access to Project Blue Book information from the U.S. Air Force, and they had access to data that Vallee brought with him from Europe, where things were a little bit more accepting and a little bit more open. He supported the idea that UFOs could be physical objects using advanced technology. and probably obeying laws of physics we don't understand. But he said data was there from witnesses about things like alterations of consciousness and physiological effects, neurological effects standing near the UFOs, lost time, increased psychic ability, and way more, which we'll talk about. And he made note of that. He said, "No, this is odd." And this group of researchers were called the Invisible College by Hynek. This was a reference, because they're all eggheads and they all know this stuff. This was a reference to a secret 17th century natural philosophy group that were fighting at the time the established dogma of the Catholic Church, because they wanted to acquire knowledge through experimentation, and science was considered the same thing as, the occult, magic, whatever. In their words, this group was inspired by the early Rosicrucians, and it became eventually, from the 17th century, became the nucleus of what was the Royal Society, the first modern scientific body. So the Invisible College thought that was pretty significant historical group, and they stole their name. And the Invisible College became, here today, well, in 75, became a large volunteer international research effort, quietly going about their business behind the scenes. And Vallee says there are now, he's speaking from the point of view of 2014, looking back on 1975. He says, we now have new questions. And what's that, 12 years ago already? God. We now have new questions since this book was written, but we still ask the same core question. What is the nature of the unidentified aerial phenomenon? This is challenging our perception of reality. What changes do we need to make in modern science to allow progress? Is there a bridge between human consciousness and higher physical dimensions? These questions are still really unanswered in 2014. So he decided to reprint this book to get it out again for a new generation. And it is well worth reading, I will say. Kind of gives us a little perspective of where we are compared to where we were. How far of a distance have we traveled? How much more do we really know? Or how more sophisticated has our attitude become? It has instigated over the years surprising new directions. So this is the introduction that was written in 1975. And some of this is going to sound kind of funny, like, oh my God, did you know that people have seen UFOs? Because people were not talking about it. So he says there have been thousands of sightings in the last 25 years. So since the 50s, since the very early 50s, since, I don't know, a little thing called Roswell in the late 40s. Obviously, these things obey their own law of physics. And we can't explain it. So this book is not an investigation into that. Other people are investigating that. He says this book is asking a little broader question. What's the role of UFOs? What's their intended impact on us? And what is the actual impact on us? Our cultural beliefs about the existence of forms of consciousness elsewhere in the universe are shifting, and they started shifting with the presence of UFOs. And he says probably in part because we now see how small and isolated our planet really is. Maybe we seek solutions to our ills from other civilizations out there, the rescuer theory. Vallee's hypothesis, at least at the beginning, was that UFOs are a control system. Now, this is really an interesting perspective, and it takes a little bit of real mental focus to see where he's going. And it can feel confusing or hard to understand, But I promise you, if I can understand it, anybody can understand it. And I think I understand what he's saying. And if I do, then it's really interesting theory. And it ties in with another book that we read a while back called American Cosmic by D.W. Pasulka. And this woman is a professor of religion, theology. I think her area of expertise from which she got her PhD was Marian apparitions, you know, the Blessed Mother showing up on a burning bush type of thing. Very interesting woman. She met Jacques Vallee. They had lengthy conversations about this theory, but this book is where this theory started to cook. And this book is where it arrived so far. So let's go back to his hypotheses that UFOs are a control system, that they're not only extraterrestrial visitors. They can be, but they are not only that. They're not delusions, for sure. People who see them are not imagining things. They're not misidentifications. They're not hoaxes. Sure, there are hoaxers. Sure, there are people who see a comet and think it's the Martians. You know, I mean, of course, there are exceptions to every possibility. He's talking the bulk on the whole. He likens UFOs, and I know UAP is the appropriate term, but I don't care. I'm stuck in the past, UFOs. He likens UFOs to the manifestations of a process like a thermostat. Now, bear with us here. A thermostat stabilizes the relationship between hot and cold. And he says that UFOs stabilize the relationship between our consciousness and what it needs and the evolving complexities of our world. So they're serving a function. They're affecting our consciousness. They come and they go. There's a reason for that. And they don't just come and go individually. They come and go in flaps. I don't believe he ever uses that term, but a flap is when all of a sudden there'll be a cluster of sightings in a region. The Phoenix Lights, that's a perfect example. There are many, many stories of areas globally where, you know, some little village in Mexico, suddenly over a period of a few months, everyone's seeing UFOs all the time. And then they stop. And then later on, they start somewhere else, or later on, or simultaneously, they're happening somewhere else. And Jacques Vallee has a theory why. It blew my mind. So hang on. Where were we? So it's a process like a thermostat that tries to stabilize the relationship by our consciousness and its needs and the evolving complexities of our world. So his colleagues take two approaches. There's the technical approach, the nuts and bolts of the physics, the science, the engineering. You know, they study and measure the movement and measure the light and measure, you know, the actual physical data that they can get from them. But then there's the psychic data. And he proposes the idea that UFOs are archetypes, that they're a fulfillment of the psychic need of the experiencer. Okay, so just file that away. Modern science separates these two domains. It's either one or the other. They don't meet. And he's saying, oh, yes, they do. Vallee says that this is an arbitrary distinction, that they're not two different things, the physical and the psychic. They're all a part of a whole. The UFO is a challenge to the arbitrary dichotomy between the physical and spiritual reality. And here's what I find so interesting is he jumps right in and uses the S word. He says spiritual. He was using the psychic word, and that's threatening to many people too. And keep in mind, he's talking about this in 1975. Here he's equating UFOs with the psychic and spiritual experience, equating psychic and spiritual, and equating UFOs and psychic and spiritual. This may not be a new concept for us. I know it's not, because I know we've talked about it. This was shattering concept when he first wrote about it. So he says his book's not about physical reality. He's not going to argue what kind of metal they make and what the laws of physics are. He's not interested in that. He is, but not in this book. He says he's going to use the framework of descriptive phenomenology. Okay. So let's see here. So instead of asking, like physicists, does the phenomenon interact with measurable quantities of its environment? Or ask, like the psychologist, what mental impulses or behavioral needs does the report fulfill? Instead of doing that, he says, we will review what is experienced by the witnesses. We will observe what they do as a result of these experiences, and we will attempt to correlate them within a total framework. We try to explain what they are. So he gives the example of the Marian apparition in Egypt after 1968. And he said 6 days after it appeared, the 6-Day War happened. As phenomenologists, we suspend judgment as to whether the apparition is really real. He says that's a question for scientific naturalism. And instead, we attempt rather to understand what people do when confronting stress. If men define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. This comes from a paper called Stress, Religious Experience, and Mental Health. Now, there's a topic. So the UFO phenomena are real, whether they're really real or they seem real to the witness, because in either case, they're physically real or the witness feels they're real, the witness is affected. And that's what we want to look at, the effect. What is the purpose? What is the effect intended possibly to be? Vallee thinks it's a control system over humans, over our beliefs. It's a control over the relationship between consciousness and our physical reality. And he believes it's been here since time began. So the fact that it assumes a form of space visitors is of secondary importance. It's just trying to relate to something that we can kind of relate to. A UFO we see can have measurable physical realities, and it can be a window towards another mode of reality. So a witness can describe a concrete physical thing, aspects of something, and forms of life, and the behavior of the forms of life and of the object, and have no real framework for it. They may be projections, they may be real, they may be a product of our dreams. He says we can explore the hidden meaning or ignore them, and like dreams, they may shape our lives in ways that we can't understand. So it's like they're presented, we decide, is this going to affect us? How is it going to affect us? So, you have the people who ignore it, the people who write it off as a hoax, a delusion, a mistake, the people who think it's a real physical thing, and as such, it's visitors from elsewhere. And there are those who think it's visitors from other planets. There are those who think visitors from other dimensions, visitors from other times, visitors from our future, visitors from our far, far distant past. Lots of theories. All of that, he says, takes a back seat to the real question, which is, how does it affect us? Because that's its purpose, to affect us. So he and many astronomers have seen and tracked UFOs. Now that's big news in 1975. He says the objects were not necessarily spectacular, but the reaction of the French scientists was minimization and denial. And they tried to explain away what they'd seen, and they destroyed data, which is really what shocked Vallee. they couldn't explain it. They destroyed it. And I wrote in the margin here that the object doesn't have to be spectacular. And I wrote, well, like my UFO, my husband and I saw a UFO, and it wasn't spectacular, and it didn't shock us, and it didn't challenge our sense of reality. It confirmed what we suspected. It was not dramatic. It was watching satellites at night, and suddenly a satellite stopped acting like a satellite. It stood completely still, and it changed directions abruptly numerous times, zigzagging and moving. Satellites don't do that. Comets don't do that. Shooting stars don't do that. It never changed its brilliance. It looked like a lit up satellite, looks like a star that's moving. Went off path, moved around in all different directions, stopped, moved, stopped. That's not okay. And then suddenly shot off into the outer space in a burst of light. And we went, oh, guess we saw a UFO. We're so jaded. Now, because we both know, that they exist and that they are something. So how did that affect us? I hadn't asked myself that. That's a good question to ask. I'll have to think about that. But you can't always expect that you're going to see gray aliens, and you can't expect that you're going to see something on land. We're not all going to have a, what was his name? The guy, Tim Walton, that got abducted and was gone for days and almost died and had all these experiences. That doesn't happen for everybody. So the reaction of the other scientists gave Vallee invaluable insight into what he calls scientific skepticism. He says it helped him to connect with scientists that were open to studying things like this, thereby becoming the invisible college. So he says he's curious about scientists who destroy or distort evidence or ignore it. That is remarkable. If you've been in science, it's doubly remarkable. It's not just duplicitous, because you expect a scientist to be open to attempt to interpret all of the data. A true scientist doesn't toss out what he or she can't explain. That's just bizarre. So Vallee said he's curious about them. And he said that there's an unfortunate stigma on the subject of UFOs. I don't think it's as bad as it was in 75. But that could just be me. I surround myself with people who talk about them like it's, the city bus. But there are people who are really sensitive about it. So he points to the thousands of unexplained sightings and the books about them. And he says there's a few, excuses or explanations, theories for them, that they're inventions, that they're hoaxes, delusions, mirages. I thought of that one. Or extraterrestrials. And he disagrees with all of this. He says that he used computers to examine tons of data about ETs, and he rejects the idea that they're merely off-planet beings. He's not saying that they're not. He's saying that there's more to it than that. He says they're of a different reality. He says we cannot ignore, we have to acknowledge the psychic effects of UFOs. Very important feature. Space-time distortions, people losing time, people finding themselves in one place and then in another. Just all the weirdness. People materializing and dematerializing. And also the UFOs. Telepathic communication. Most of the time people don't say, well, the alien talked to me. It was all done mentally. And then, of course, increased psychic ability after the sightings. So he gives some examples, and some of these are older examples that I think we may be familiar with, but I actually left out in my synopsis. I left out some things that seem painfully obvious, but let's talk about this. In October of 73, a guy came to Vallee with what he called a mission. He was an engineering executive in a suit, kind of, buttoned up. And he came to the United States to work for an electronic company. And he said that he came after having been taken onto a UFO and taught things. And he said it made him no longer the same person. Now, this is a classic variation on an abduction story, which we now, I've heard that before. But in 75, this was a big deal. This man did not want publicity. He was just wanting to tell the message that he'd been given. He thought it was important. And he kept reiterating, I'm just not the same person. Then another guy with the same kind of story came to Vallee a year earlier. And this guy's name was Uri Geller. That might ring a bell. And Uri Geller, he figured in the entertainment media noise that goes on in the background that you may or may not pay attention to. When I was a teenager, he was an Israeli psychic who was claimed he was taken on a UFO. His life was changed. He left his country. He had a mission, and his experiences increased his physical and psychic effects. Because Vallee had been talking with Geller for more than a year, he was willing to listen to this guy in the suit who was the engineer who came to him with his story. Very similar. He said he was, in 1961, this is the story of the man who approached Vallee. In 1961, he was working and he was walking on an archaeological field trip in the countryside. And he had 4 other people with him, and they got separated from each other. He saw a disc, and he was taken by some kind of elevator inside of it. The whole thing felt dreamlike to him. He was taken far away to a desolate area, and he landed near a large machine like a computer. And in those days, if you remember early computers, they could take up a whole room. And for the next 3 hours, this thing took recordings from itself and put them into his brain. He was flown back to the original spot and discovered that he'd been missing for 18 days. His dad, who was a government official, had called out the cops and the military, and everybody was searching for him. He was found in the exact same spot from which he had disappeared. The flower that he had put in his lapel before he saw the disc, it was still fresh. His clothes were clean. He didn't need a shave. He couldn't explain it. And everyone was so freaked and thought he lied and put so much pressure on him. He was really beginning to get worried that, there was a lot of animosity. So he just said it was a joke. He didn't know it was going to be so bad. But he said he felt he had completely changed. He was a different person. For the next 6 months, for example, he required huge amounts of sleep. He would sleep 13 hours at a time. And then the pattern changed and began to need less and less and less sleep. And when he met Vallee, he was down to only an hour or 2 a night. All of his university classes were 100%. Now he just 100% on everything. And he had total recall. He had never been physically sick since he saw this UFO experience. And then going back to Geller, he was brought to the United States in 71 by a parapsychologist who wanted to study him in his lab. He had the ability to affect material objects, even getting them to dematerialize. He was famous for bending spoons. It was this little party trick he did. He was surrounded by poltergeist phenomenon similar to international folklore about weird entities that cause poltergeist activity. For example, things would break or disappear around him. He felt that he'd been given a mission, but he was kind of a narcissistic kind of character. He was a showman, So this was right up his alley to take advantage of this situation. The other guy was quiet and withdrawn and secretive. He wanted to be unknown. So I'm not sure. I think Geller still we're talking about. I didn't make my notes very clear. So I don't think we're talking about the other guy who was quiet and withdrawn. Now back to Geller. He can make himself have out-of-body experiences. He can transfer his consciousness at will to objects or to space. He has psychokinetic power, make things move just with his mind. So he moved to California, where he thinks there will be major socio-political changes. And after his experience, his perfect eyesight deteriorated. He says it was because of the blinding, blinking lights on the machine that he first saw. So there are similarities between both of these men's experiences. I put what, with a big question mark, next to he moved to California, who he thinks there'll be a major socio-political changes. That was in 1975. I don't know what to make of that. But they also both experienced psychic effects. They both entered the craft and got information from them. Vallee lists 4 components that forced a new interpretation of UFOs, that they weren't a psychosis, they weren't a fraud. This is 4 ways to look at them. First, the psychic component and the information transfer. That was significant. The next is the nature of the personal, social, and government reaction. There's like a triple cover-up. People don't want to admit it to themselves. They don't want to tell other people. The government doesn't want anybody to know. This, I'd say, is a little less common now. It's not entirely gone, though. The third effect is the observation of patterns of belief. So people will have these experiences and suddenly come out with a new religious or mystical movement, or be really into philosophy and metaphysics, often becoming kind of leaders of groups. And finally, sophisticated exploitation by groups. And we'll talk about that later, so just file that away. We're still in the introduction here, by the way. He says, in this book, we'll investigate religious experiences and miracles associated with UFOs, and we'll look at the psychic phenomenon. Vallee is looking for a concept of the purpose of the technology that takes surprising forms to produce modern signs in the sky. He says, every human activity has a secret side, and scientists don't give all the data that they collect the light of day. Not all the facts are made public, which, you could tell Vallee frowns upon that. As the century of science draws to an end, more and more of the material that researchers discover fails to be published because it fits into no convenient pre-existing framework. In particular, the UFO phenomenon is still largely ignored by science, although it has been a subject of persistent mystery for the last 25 years. I would say it's not entirely ignored these days. I mean, they talk about it in congressional hearings. So, okay, let's see. One fact, he says, something mysterious is manifesting in our environment. It's seen, it's tracked, it's filmed, touched, adored, denied, prayed to, cursed, celebrated. It's a thing. And he says this is a personal interpretation, this book of UFOs, based on changes in human consciousness associated with them. The Invisible College challenges conventional ideas. There's no theory that should be rejected, and they're making a serious effort to understand what's going on. They've used technology, they've collected much astounding data, and he was invited in because he's such an expert on computers and because of how much he's learned that has not been made public. So now, meaning 1975, he says, you see that the conventional study is inadequate because the technology is not advanced that we have, and our ideas are obsolete. We're getting left behind. We can't study the abilities of Geller and this other guy that he talked about with any kind of scientific technique alone. He hopes his book will encourage broader community engagement, like social engagement. He doesn't believe that humans are being contacted by spacemen. He says there's more to it than that. He doesn't believe the message. Now, he's not denying that that might be a thing. He's just saying that there's an intention behind it that we're ignoring. He doesn't believe the message of the other guy, which the other guy told him that the beings don't have a religion, that they live in a never-ending love. They live longer and can replace any organ. And Vallee says he doesn't believe that message. And my question is, why? Why doesn't he? Why doesn't he believe that that's possible? He didn't elaborate. He believes the guy is sincere, but rejects his belief. I guess he did say why he believed it. Hang on. Why he rejected it. I believe, he says, that a powerful force has influenced the human race in the past and is again influencing it now. Does this force originate entirely within human consciousness, or does it represent alien intervention? This is the question that forms the basis of the work of the Invisible College. And here is what we know. Okay. Chapter 1, the psychic component. Put the book away too soon. In August of 1960, I witnessed the appearance of 2 UFOs, and since that time have had occasional encounters with the phenomena. All of my experiences of this nature have been closely associated with psychic awareness in one form or another. That's a letter he got in 1974. During the drive between Burford and Stratford, I had some startling and, to me, novel insights into what I can only describe as the nature of reality. They were connected in some way to this shining disk that she saw, and it had a profound effect on me, causing what is commonly known as a personality change. I won't try to explain what these insights were, since almost all of the religions of the world have tried to do this and have failed, and that's a letter he got from a witness in 1973. He calls this part of the chapter the return of a specter. The public doesn't tolerate a mystery that refuses to die. In 1973, UFOs were spotted across the United States. 2 men from Mississippi told of being abducted by robots. The public assumed that science had put an end to these kind of rumors. They kind of died out and everyone dismissed them. Then the Condon report came from the University of Colorado. It cost $500,000 at the time and was 800 pages. And it decided that UFOs were useless to pursue the whole topic. They destroyed their files. They wanted documentary footage burned. The U.S. Air Force closed its public relations office for reports coming from the public. This was called Project Blue Book. Ostensibly, the whole thing was shut down. And then came a new flurry of sightings globally, paid to all that conclusion. Witnesses didn't understand what they'd seen, but they couldn't forget it. For example, a couple of truck drivers were fired after reporting objects following them on a Missouri road. They reported a burst of light that caused temporary blindness and melted glass frames. This was unbelievable to local scientists who refused to look at the larger context. The Condon team had not had previous experience or knowledge of any of this. It was necessary to know the extent that there are thousands of sightings that have happened over 25 years, including globally, which gives it some perspective, he says. Because it's global, we need to look at all the reports, not just the United States. A lot of this stuff wasn't in the United States. It was in Portugal. It was in Spain. And they're a better source of information. At least they were in 75. Witness reports were taken more seriously, better documented, better communicated, and taken immediately. When they appear in low population areas, the media tend to pay less attention. More and more, the reports of paranormal activity are associated with UFOs. And this is difficult for some investigators. This shakes up the scientists. They sometimes overlook it or minimize it or dismiss it as unimportant or coincidence. Sometimes it's very hard to ignore this stuff. There are a number of witnesses who claim they're getting messages in their heads telepathically from UFOs. They're able to document distortions in time and space, violations of our laws of physics, materializing and dematerializing of the phenomena and the people involved. Right? People lifted up and floated through walls with witnesses. So there's some sort of a psychic component to all of this, and it can seem absurd. It can cause some scientists to just reject the whole topic. They don't want to be bothered. They don't want to be associated with it. Because Vallee's area is information and it's transliteration from documents, technology. He is more open to these ideas, psychic ideas, and he can use techniques in his field of study that may not be available to other kinds of scientists. At least they weren't when computers were not much of a thing. He sees patterns because that's how his brain works. He sees outbursts of UFO activity, flaps. People get excited. They want an explanation. There's acute activity that lasts for a while, sometimes even into months. And then everyone says there's a hoax, and then that explains all of it. Or there's a mistaken photograph, and that explains. There's some little thing that explains everything away. Like the two guys who claim they made all the crop circles. So now all crop circles are wrong, are not real. They're all fake. If you've studied crop circles, they're difficult for physicists and engineers and astronomers to understand. They have microwave damage to the roots of plants and to the DNA of plants, and weird heat damage to bent over crops, and it just goes on and on and on. But we don't want to know about that. So these occasional hoaxes or a mistake taint all the previous events, put a veneer of skepticism and rejection and usually ridicule. And therefore, hundreds of genuine sightings and hundreds of genuine events are just dismissed, ignored. Some scientists stick with it. They continue to study despite the apparent absurdity. More and more, they have to center their focus on the psychic component. You can't deny it. And they're finding more and more that there's ESP connection between the witnesses and the phenomenon. Now, this doesn't seem so odd to us now, I wouldn't think, because we're kind of been exposed to these ideas. But at the time, it was something else. So this is called Over the Accelerator. These chapters have subheadings, multiple subheadings. In February of 72, along a valley near Menlo Park by Stanford, there's this linear accelerator. Don't ask me to explain it. It's just a physics thing with atoms and stuff. Anyway, a man saw a UFO rise one evening and by this linear accelerator, and he heard a humming, and the humming increased as the object came into view. It was glowing red. It flew along the accelerator along the length of the valley. It went out of sight, turned around and came back, and then it went up high and fast. He said it was like looking at the sun or the inside of a star. One of the guys that saw this reported it. There was more than one. Had seen a UFO before in Montana. He'd seen 2 discs that flew and hovered over a field. He approached to about 75 feet and felt like he was under observation, like somebody inside was looking at him. Then he felt like he was being communicated with. He felt they were aware of him. He said it was kind of like standing near a whale, which I don't know. I don't really understand that, because when's the last time you stood near a whale? So this is called Do Not Report This. For 25 years, up to about the mid-70s, 5,000 plus unresolved UFO reports were made, way more actually. Some are so mystifying that because they have reports of paranormal or psychic activity that go along with them. Understanding UFO activity might shed the light on the mechanisms of psychic phenomena, or vice versa. He's open to this. So Vallee discusses UFO sightings in which a woman heard in her head telepathically this quote, "This is all right for you to see, and you should not report this." This is what she heard. She told Vallee years later at a talk that he gave about repressed contact, like you try to forget it. What to make of telepathic commands from UFO sightings? There's the need to keep an open mind about the psychic component. It's not unusual to find with UFOs after people will have precognition, telepathy. They'll have the ability to heal. That's an interesting one. And there's more intense psychic phenomenon associated with closer proximity to the UFO. The closer you get, the more it affects you psychically. And direct exposure to light that comes from them. He describes a UFO experience of a French doctor in 1968 who wanted to keep anonymous. He got up in the middle of the night because his baby was crying. His sighting included non-earthly things, 2 discs that merged and then dematerialized and didn't have anything to do with Earth physics. They couldn't figure it out. The light from the disc hit the doctor in his face as he looked out the window, and the disc disappeared. So he got up for the baby, looked out the window, got hit by light. The disc disappeared. But he discovered he'd had a big bruise on his leg, probably from getting up in the middle of the night with the baby, no light on. And he had this bruise on his leg. It was 100% gone immediately. And in the following days, an old war wound disappeared, including some paralysis of one of his legs. He also felt he felt sick. And then he found a red triangle on his stomach. The dermatologist didn't know what it was. It was so weird. The dermatologist wrote it up in a professional medical journal, like, what the heck is this? And the next night, the doctor dreamed that the red triangle actually connected with the UFO in the sky. And the next day when he got up, the baby had a red triangle on its abdomen. This is all documented. The doctor only told his wife, and he and she have a totally different attitude now towards life and death. It's really affected them. All sorts of paranormal activity have been happening in their lives, including levitation. Now, levitation means that you negate the effects of gravity. And this is reported more than a little bit in connection with UFOs. For example, a man was walking a horse and he had to let go of the bridle. A UFO flew overhead and the horse levitated into the air. Uri Geller and Edgar Cayce both had UFO experiences that inspired their interest in the paranormal. And it's particularly significant for Edgar Cayce given the time that he lived. As a child, Edgar Cayce met a woman who appeared out of a sphere of radiant light and told him that he would be able to heal the sick when he grew up. As soon as the weather was good, he went back to his retreat in the woods. He had a little place he hung out in. And there, one afternoon in May, he became aware of the presence of someone else. He looked up. A woman was standing before him. "Your prayers have been heard," she said. "Tell me what you would like most of all so I may give it to you. Most of all, I would like to be helpful to others and especially to children when they were sick." Suddenly, she was no longer there. He looked at the place where she had gone, trying to see her in the beam of light, but there was nothing. His sighting is reminiscent of several cases that fall into the category of religious experience. That might sound familiar, right? Which we're going to talk about more. They're like Marian apparitions, religious apparitions that are often accompanied by new healing or prophetic abilities. Geller believes his psychokinetic abilities definitely came from UFOs. What do UFOs communicate to us? Sometimes people see symbols, sometimes they're metaphors. ETs give the wrong time of the day as if to say time has no meaning. So they don't say, hey, time has no meaning. They might ask, what time is it? And you look at the clock and you see the time and they say, no, it's this time. And there's an implied message there that it's meaningless anyway. Feels like a stretch to me, but maybe not. I don't know. Barney Hill was trying to explain humans' focus on time to the aliens that abducted him. And they were just like, they could not relate. The South American experiencer was given a message: consciousness transcends time. ET messages are often mystical and paradoxical because the truths conveyed transcend our semantic abilities. In other words, we're having a hard time understanding what they're trying to get to us, convey to us. We don't have the brain power, the verbal power. Vallee believes the notion that UFOs are merely crafts from other planets is naive. It doesn't account for the phenomena associated with UFOs. He says they're meant to bypass intelligence and intelligentsia and church people. They're meant to bypass all of the know-it-alls. And they remain undetectable to the military, although not anymore. And they leave undisturbed the politics and the administration of society. And that's a big question mark. Why? They're always dodging being discovered. They plant concerns in the mind of society, doubts about its basic philosophical tenets, doubts about its values. And I wrote in the margin, and Nate will be happy to hear what I wrote. I wrote three-eye atlas, question mark, question mark. Let me repeat again what made me say that. These UFOs plant concerns in society, doubts about our basic philosophical tenets and values. To avoid detection, they interfere. Wait a minute, I read that wrong. To avoid detection and interference, they would have to project an image just beyond the belief system of the society and time and place to which they appear. So they're intentionally a little advanced, a little different physics, a little bit more technical. In the past, when they would appear, they were gods and goddesses, or they were imps or leprechauns, or they were the Blessed Virgin and saints and angels. They change with the time and place to which they appear. But there seems to be a consistency behind the fact of an appearance. He believes that UFO's image of alien vehicles masks a really more complex nature of the technology that causes the sightings. In the 70s, he's talking about creating a database of sightings, and they have formidable impact on our psyches. He says his ideas contradict both skeptics and the timid few believers. But he says he's spoken with scientists in the Invisible College, and they are very open to his ideas. We're going to stop here because the next part should not be interrupted, and it's a little bit long. So this is the end of video number 1, and we'll begin video number 2 here in a minute. And in the meantime, appreciate you watching. I hope you find this interesting. Definitely let me know. And we've done a little bit of Jacques Vallee before. We did Passport to Magonia, I think is the name of it. It's all about folklore in relationship to UFOs. It's really interesting. All right. Thank you very much for watching. I'll be back. Slongafoil, Slanja.